Imagine a boy standing beside a railway line, watching a train roar past, carrying the rulers of his country in plush, shaded carriages, while he stands barefoot in the dust, eyes stinging from the smoke. In that moment, he does not know that one day he will challenge the very empire that owns those tracks, and that the clock will be ticking against him every step of the way. Fred Kubai's story begins far from offices, speeches, or parliament benches. It begins with the sound of steel clashing against steel, the whine of locomotive brakes, and the sharp metallic smell of a colony being built on someone else's land. He was born in 1917 in a Kenya that did not yet belong to its people, a Kenya mapped, measured, and ruled from far away. For the colonial officials, he was just one more African child in an anonymous crowd. For his family, he was a pair of small, determined hands that might one day lift them out of hardship. Picture the world into which he opened his eyes. White settlers riding past on horses, their boots spotless, while African workers bent their backs in fields and on construction sites, their fingers cracked and bleeding. Every building, every road, every mile of railway seemed to shout the same message. Power was somewhere else. Power belonged to someone else. The British flag flew over government offices, over police stations, over schools that most African children could never enter. The rules were written in a language many of them were not even allowed to learn. From an early age, Fred felt that distance like a physical wall. He saw it in the way police officers spoke to his elders, in the way his parents lowered their voices when they talked about the government, as if the very word could summon trouble. He learned that in colonial Kenya, the wrong word at the wrong time could cost you everything. Your job, your home, even your freedom. Silence was not just politeness, it was survival. But silence did not come naturally to him. As a boy, Fred had questions, dangerous questions. Why did some men ride and others walk? Why did some people have land that stretched further than his eyes could see, while his own family struggled on tiny plots? Why did the law always seem to protect one side and punish the other? Often his elders would hush him. These are things we don't talk about loudly. Yet the questions did not go away. They only sank deeper, like hot coals waiting for the right moment to burst into flame. School, when he could attend it, opened another door. Mission teachers introduced him to reading and writing, to the idea that knowledge could be a weapon as sharp as any spear. He realized something shocking. The words on the paper, the rules in the books, the orders pinned to notice boards, they did not come from God or from some unchangeable destiny. They came from people. Every law had once been a decision. Every order had once been an idea in someone's mind. If people could create these rules, then people could also challenge them. Yet there was another lesson, less inspiring and far more brutal. Even with learning, there were limits. The best jobs, the highest positions, the real salaries were reserved for Europeans and a handful of carefully chosen Asians. Africans, no matter how bright, would hit an invisible ceiling. You could be useful, but not equal. For a time, Fred tried to ignore that reality. Like many young men of his generation, he hoped that if he worked hard enough, he might carve out a better life within the system. The railways seemed like a path, steady work, a skill, a wage. The Kenya and Uganda Railway was the steel spine of the colony, carrying coffee, tea, and people between the port of Mombasa and the growing city of Nairobi. If you worked there, you stood close to the pulse of power, close enough perhaps to feel important. When Fred joined the railway service as a young man, the first thing that hit him wasn't the prestige. It was the noise, engines shrieking, couplings clashing, foremen shouting, and beneath all of it, the constant grinding certainty that trains would mve on time, no matter who had to break their back to make it happen. He learned quickly. He became a telegraph operator, a job that might have seemed small from the outside, but which gave him a front-row seat to the machinery of empire. He sat in a cramped office, fingers hovering over equipment, listening to the staccato rhythm of messages racing up and down the line. From Mombasa to Kisumu, from government offices to police stations, the colony spoke in urgent bursts of code, and Fred was the silent intermediary, translating power from pulses to words. Think about that for a moment. A young African man, living under a system that tried to keep him invisible, suddenly entrusted with the flow of information that kept that system alive. Orders about troop movements, schedules for officials, reports on strikes and native unrest. All of it flashing before his eyes. He saw how decisions were made. He saw which districts got attention and which were ignored. He saw how quickly the authorities could move when settlers complained, and how slowly they responded when African workers begged for help. And slowly, a disturbing sense began to grow in him. He wasn't just watching injustice from the outside anymore. He was part of the machine that made it possible. That realization was a twist he had not expected. One evening, long after most people had left the station, Fred stayed late, finishing a backlog of messages. The office was lit by a single humming lamp. As he worked the keys, he paused on one message. A report about workers being flogged for insubordination on a distant estate. The punishment described in cold, precise language. It was his job to pass it on. Nothing more, just translate and transmit. His fingers hovered over the device and refused to move. In that frozen moment, he felt the weight of something new. Responsibility. If he simply forwarded this message, he was doing more than obeying orders. He was helping to maintain a system that treated men like animals. Yet if he refused, if he tampered with the communication, he could be dismissed, imprisoned, or worse. Telegraph operators were supposed to be invisible, anonymous, obedient. That night, he sent the message. He did his job, but something inside him cracked. From then on, every click of the telegraph, every white officer barking instructions, every loaded train that thundered past, everything felt different. The world hadn't changed. Fred had. He could no longer pretend that he was merely chasing a better wage. He was standing at a crossroads he had never asked for. And on the other side of that crossroads, whether he knew it or not, lay politics. The first seeds of open resistance entered his life through whispers. Rumors of African workers holding secret meetings after dark. Stories of leaders speaking up in Nairobi, demanding better pay, shorter hours, respect. At first, it sounded impossible. The colonial state seemed too big, too organized, too ruthless. How could a group of underpaid workers stand up against an empire that had conquered half the globe? Yet those rumors persisted, and with them came names. Names that would one day echo across Kenya's history. Names like Jomo Kenyatta. Names of trade unionists and activists who believed that independence was not a distant dream, but a demand that could be made in their own lifetimes. As these ideas spread, something else appeared in Fred's path. A rival. His name for our purposes can be David. He was another African working in the orbit of the railway administration, ambitious, sharp, and charming. Where Fred's questions were often blunt, David's were wrapped in smiles. He believed in progress too, but a different kind of progress. The kind negotiated in quiet offices through small favors and patient compromise. He cultivated friendships with European supervisors, accepted tokens of recognition, and believed that the safest way forward was to be seen as reasonable. Fred and David were not enemies at first. They might chat during breaks, sharing cigarettes, complaining about long hours. But gradually, the line between them became clearer. When workers talked about the need to organize, to stand together and demand change, David shook his head. "You're playing with fire," he would say. "Look, I'm not against better conditions, but you have to be smart. The government has power we can't even imagine. You push too hard, they push back, and we are the ones who break." Fred listened. Part of him agreed. He had seen what power looked like in the messages he sent and in the raids he'd heard about. Yet another part of him, the part that remembered that boy beside the railway line, staring at the train he could not board, whispered, "If not now, when? If not us, who?" The real turning point came with a deadline. The railway administration announced a new set of rules. Tighter controls, stricter working conditions, harsher penalties for indiscipline. It wasn't just about hours, it was about dignity. Workers would be searched more aggressively. Leave would be more restricted. Complaints would be routed through a new representative, a man close to management, someone like David. They gave the workers a date. From this day forward, the new regulations would be law. That date became a ticking clock in Fred Kubai's mind. He saw what it meant. Once those rules were in place, it would be much harder to fight back. The administration was moving preemptively, tightening its grip before union ideas could spread further. If the workers did not act now, they might not get another chance for years. Maybe not in his lifetime. Whispers turned into intense discussions in cramped rooms and quiet corners of the station. Some men were terrified. Others were angry. A few were simply tired, worn down by years of being told where to stand, when to speak, how to exist. Fred, who had once been just another pair of hands, now found himself at the center of these conversations. Men he respected looked to him and asked, "What do we do?" He didn't have a title. He didn't have a position. He had something else, a reputation for speaking honestly, for refusing to flatter those in power, for asking the questions others were too afraid to voice. In those nights, under the dim glow of lanterns, he started to do something he had never imagined himself doing. He started to organize. He talked to workers about their rights, not as gifts from the administration, but as things they could claim together. He explained what a union could be. Not a threat, but a shield. He spoke about unity in a language that was not written in any colonial manual. And as he spoke, he could feel the room changing. The air growing thicker, the men sitting straighter, as if some invisible weight was being lifted and replaced by another. Hope, but hope alone would not be enough. The administration was not blind. Supervisors began asking questions. Why were workers lingering after shifts? Why were they whispering in corners? Names were mentioned. One of those names was Fred Kubai. David, his rival, approached him one evening, his voice low, his expression tense. "Fred, you have to stop this," he said. "They're already watching you. They ask me about you in the office. They want to know who's behind these talks. I told them you're a good man, not a troublemaker. Don't make me a liar." "Then don't lie," Fred replied quietly. "That's exactly what I'm trying to avoid. Listen, if you keep pushing, they'll sack you. And it won't end there. You know what they did in other colonies. Detentions, beatings, people disappear. You can't fight them head on. You have a future here. Don't throw it away." For a moment, Fred wavered. This was not an abstract threat. He had seen the reports, carried news of crackdowns through his telegraph keys. He knew what the empire could do when it felt challenged. The rational part of his mind screamed, "Step back. Be careful. Wait for a better moment." But the better moment never comes by itself. Someone has to create it. "What future?" he asked finally. "A future of obeying orders and watching other men suffer because I kept quiet. If that's the future, they can keep it." David stared at him, frustration flaring in his eyes. "You think you're the only one who cares?" he snapped. "You think compromise is cowardice. When they come for you, you'll wish you had listened." The rivalry between them crystallized in that instant. It wasn't just personal, it was ideological. Two paths lay before Kenya's people, one of measured collaboration, hoping the colonizers might slowly loosen their grip, the other of organized resistance, demanding that they let go. And the deadline was drawing closer. Day by day, the pressure grew. The administration pinned notices in workshops and offices, reminding workers of the coming changes. White supervisors spoke in patronizing tones about efficiency and discipline, pretending the new rules were for everyone's benefit. Police presence near the railway yards increased. The message was clear. We are watching. Do not test us. For Fred, every passing sunrise felt like a drumbeat. He knew that once the deadline arrived, fear would tighten its grip. Men might retreat, telling themselves there was nothing to be done. The moment for courage, always fragile, always fleeting, would evaporate. So he set his own deadline. They would hold a crucial meeting before the new regulations took effect. Not after, not someday, before. In that gathering, they would decide, accept the chains quietly, or stand up and risk everything. That decision would change the course of his life and his country's. On the evening chosen for the meeting, the air felt strangely heavy, as if the sky itself were waiting. Workers slipped away from their quarters and the station, moving in ones and twos, careful not to attract attention. They gathered in a hidden space, a place where light couldn't easily be seen from the road, where voices could be muffled by walls and night. Fred arrived with his heart pounding. He looked around at the faces lit by dim, flickering lamps. Younger men, older men, some with hands scarred by years on the tracks, others with the ink stains of office work. Different ages, different backgrounds, but a shared hunger in their eyes. He was not a practiced orator. His voice trembled slightly at first, but as he spoke, the tremor turned into a steady, resonant tone. "They have given us a date," he said. "A line in time. After that day, we will be more controlled, more watched, more divided than ever. They want us to come to them one by one with our little complaints, so they can pat us on the head and send us away. But we are not children. We are the ones who make these trains move. Without us, this railway is nothing but steel and rust." He paused, letting his words settle. "I won't lie to you. If we stand together, there will be a price. They will not thank us. They will try to break us. Some of us may lose our jobs. Some of us may end up in prison. I have seen what they are capable of. I know the risk." A murmur ran through the crowd. Fear, anticipation, both. "But if we do nothing," he continued, "we pay a different price. Quietly, slowly, year after year. We give up our dignity piece by piece, until there is nothing left. They have set their deadline. I say we set ours. Before their rules come into force, we show them that we are not afraid, that we are united, that we are ready to fight for our rights, not with guns, but with the one thing they fear most, our solidarity. Somewhere in that dim room, something shifted. Men who had come expecting to listen, to maybe complain a little and then return to their routines, now found themselves standing at the edge of a decision that would echo far beyond the railway yards. And in the shadows, near the back, a figure watched silently. David, his rival, his face hard to read in the low light. Fred saw him, just for a second. Their eyes met. For an instant, it was as if the two futures of Kenya, caution and confrontation, were staring at each other across a narrow, fragile space. The time for whispers was ending. The time for choices had arrived. Outside, a night train shrieked past, its whistle slicing through the darkness like a warning, or like a signal. By dawn, two African men would walk out of the same railway yard, carrying completely different kinds of power. One with a polished title blessed by the colonial office, the other with nothing but the raw, dangerous loyalty of angry workers. Only one of them would have time on his side, and it would not be Fred Kubai. The night of the secret meeting ended, as all nights do, with men slipping back into the darkness, their minds louder than their footsteps. No one shouted a decision. There was no dramatic raising of hands. Instead, it spread like a current through the cramped room. A quiet, shared understanding. Before the new regulations came into force, they would act, not with riots, not with stones, with something far more frightening to the railway administration. They would simply stop. Stop the trains, stop the telegrams, stop pretending that the system was unbreakable. They gave themselves less than a week. That was the first deadline Fred ever set that could land him in prison. The next days felt like running down a corridor that was slowly narrowing. Every shift began with the same shrill whistle, the same barked instructions, the same boots on gravel. But beneath the routine, something had changed. Workers who used to avoid each other's eyes now held them for a heartbeat longer. Conversations that once drifted towards small gossip now snapped back to the same urgent topic. Are we really doing this? Fred moved through workshops, sidings, and mess halls like a man carrying contraband fire. He spoke in low tones, always watching over his shoulder. He broke complicated ideas into simple, sharp images. If you act alone, he would say, they can crush you with one finger. If you act together, they need the whole hand, and even that might not be enough. He knew some men would betray them. Fear makes eager informers, so he didn't name everyone. He never put everything in one place. He treated trust as if it were dynamite, powerful but dangerous if mishandled. At the same time, in cooler, brighter offices, another conversation was unfolding. David sat across from a European supervisor in a room that smelled of ink and pipe smoke. On the wall, a clock ticked with an almost insulting calm. The supervisor's face carried the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the system would always favor him. "You're respected among your people, David," the man said, fingers drumming lightly on a stack of papers. "They listen to you. That's valuable, especially now." David kept his expression neutral. "They're worried," he admitted. "These new rules feel harsh." "Harshness," the supervisor replied, "is sometimes a kindness. Discipline keeps chaos away. We don't want what happened in other colonies, do we?" He leaned forward. "We're considering appointing an African liaison, someone to pass grievances to us, properly. In return, he would have certain privileges, a better salary, a say, someone like you." There it was, the offer. A small share of power, carefully fenced in, handed down rather than claimed. David felt its weight. He also knew what it meant. If he accepted, the administration wouldn't just expect loyalty. They would expect results. Calm workers, no strikes, no surprises. "And this unrest I keep hearing about?" The supervisor asked lightly. "These late-night gatherings? You hear things, I'm sure." David hesitated. He could give them names. He could protect himself, but some part of him still flinched from that line. "People complain," he said finally, "like they always do. But I think it will pass." The supervisor smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "Make sure it does. Time is short, David, for all of us." Time, always time. The morning of the action arrived wrapped in ordinary sounds. Roosters crowed, pots clanged. A few radios crackled in workers' quarters, their music too faint to disguise the tightness in people's movements. The new regulations were due to start in 48 hours. Once they did, the administration would have legal cover for almost anything it wanted to do. Searches, suspensions, expulsions, even deportations from certain areas. The men had chosen this day because it sat like a knife between the old rules and the new. Fred woke before dawn, not because of an alarm, but because his heartbeat wouldn't let him sleep anymore. He washed his face in cold water, feeling it sting his skin. For a moment he stared at his reflection, eyes tired but alert, and tried to imagine what he would look like if this went wrong. Fired, beaten, gone. Then he pictured something worse, himself years later, still in the same job, still watching other men be punished, knowing he had once had a chance to change something and had walked away. He left his room without saying goodbye. Superstition. Saying goodbye made it sound too final. At the yard, the first light of day spread thinly over steel tracks and low buildings. Men gathered in their usual places, but they did not move with their usual speed. When the whistle blew, it cut through the air like always. But this time, the sound seemed to hang there, unanswered. One man put down his tools instead of picking them up. Another stood where he was, arms crossed, ignoring the shout of a foreman. In the telegraph office, Fred took his seat but didn't touch the keys. Lines that should have been humming with early morning messages stayed silent. A locomotive at the far end of the yard coughed once, then smoothed into a steady idle, and stayed that way. For a few minutes it was confusing rather than dramatic, like a machine slowly forgetting how to work. Then, as more and more men refused orders, something became unmistakably clear. The railway was stopping, supervisors yelled, threats were flung like stones. But where one man might have bent under pressure, 10 men standing together did not move. They spoke calmly, almost eerily so, repeating what they had agreed. "We will discuss work when you discuss the new rules. Until then, we are here. But we are not working." The shock hit the administration like a cold wave. Trains that were supposed to leave waited, their iron bodies useless without the human hands that drove them. Messages that should have raced from station to station stalled. The schedule, the sacred invisible skeleton of the railway, began to collapse. For colonial officials, used to seeing Africans as replaceable, obedient labor, it was more than an inconvenience. It was an insult, an assault on the very idea of their authority. Within hours, police trucks rolled toward the yard. As word spread, nervous energy crackled through the workers. Men shifted their weight, eyes darting toward the gates. Some had never faced armed officers before. Others remembered too well what batons felt like. A few began to mutter that maybe they had made their point and should go back before things got out of hand. This was the moment the administration had been waiting for. They sent David. He emerged flanked by 2 officials, their uniforms crisp, their faces set. He was dressed more neatly than usual, his shirt ironed, his shoes shining. It was a small detail, but every eye caught it. He walked ahead of the officers, hands raised in a calming gesture, as if he were one of the workers instead of a bridge to their bosses. "My brothers," he called out, voice firm but soothing, "listen to me. I understand why you're angry. I do. These rules are harsh. But this," he gestured around at the idle trains, "this is not the way. You're giving them a reason to crack down harder. You'll lose your wages, your jobs. Some of you have families, children. Is this worth putting them at risk?" The words pierced. They were not lies. That made them more dangerous. Officials stood behind him, pretending to be patient, the very picture of tolerant authority. "Let the African calm his own people," their posture said. "Then we'll decide who must be punished." Fred stepped forward, his heart pounding so loudly he could almost hear it in his ears. He didn't have a polished shirt or shining shoes. What he had was the memory of the men in that dim meeting room, the weight of their hope pressing on his shoulders. Standing a few paces from David, he spoke not to him, but to the crowd. "Everything he says is true," Fred began quietly. "You could lose your pay, your job, your freedom. That is a real risk. But ask yourself, when have they ever given us anything we didn't fight for? These rules, they didn't ask us about them. They didn't consult us. They just pinned a notice on the wall and expected us to bow our heads." He pointed at a locomotive, silent behind them. "Who built this? Who keeps it moving? Do you think they treat us badly because they don't understand our value? No, they understand it perfectly. That's why they want us afraid. That's why they send David to talk, and policemen to stand behind him." He turned, meeting David's eyes at last. "You tell us to think of our families," he said. "I am thinking of them. I'm thinking of the world our children will grow up in if we never say no. Today we are not breaking anything. We are standing still. If they beat us for standing still, then let the world see who is violent and who is peaceful." The yard was silent. Even the engines seemed to be listening. For a long, brittle moment, it could have gone either way. If enough men had stepped toward David, the strike would have dissolved into murmurs and excuses. If they had scattered, each one calculating his own chances, the administration would have won without lifting a stick. Then an older worker, his hands scarred from decades on the line, stepped to Fred's side. "I'm staying," he said simply. Another man joined him, and another. The line grew, not with cries, but with footsteps. David watched as the tide he had hoped to turn instead flowed around him, toward the man the authorities feared. The officials moved forward. Orders were barked. A few workers were grabbed, dragged away, shoved into trucks. But the rest held their ground. There were no stones, no fires, just a stubborn refusal to work. It was, in its quiet way, more terrifying to the colonial state than a riot would have been. Riots could be crushed and dismissed as chaos. This was discipline, organization, intent. By evening, something remarkable happened. Under pressure from higher offices unnerved by the paralysis of the railway, the administration blinked. A message came down. Some of the new regulations would be reviewed. Language was softened. Certain search procedures were suspended, pending further discussion. It was not a full victory. Many injustices remained firmly in place. But the line had been crossed in the other direction now. The empire had been forced, however slightly, to step back. And everyone knew whose voice had carried the day. Word of what Fred had done traveled faster than the trains that had stood still. In Nairobi, in Mombasa, in small townships where men gathered in the evenings to talk over cheap tea, his name began to surface, always, spoken with a mixture of caution and admiration. The railway man who made them listen. The telegraph operator who defied them. For the first time in his life, Fred Kubai felt the strange, unsettling sensation of influence extending beyond his own workplace. It did not take long for that influence to attract new invitations. In the smoky upper rooms of Nairobi's meeting halls, African leaders were already gathering to discuss more than wages. They spoke of land stolen and fenced off, of chiefs co-opted and corrupted, of soldiers who had fought in foreign wars only to return, to a country that still treated them as children. The name on everyone's lips was Jomo Kenyatta, the increasingly visible face of a movement demanding that Kenya belong to its people. When trade unionists in the city heard about the railway action, they wanted to meet the man behind it. One evening, Fred climbed a narrow staircase off a busy Nairobi street and walked into a room that felt more like a storm cloud than a space. The air was thick with smoke and argument. At one end, a tall man in a simple suit spoke with quiet intensity, his words measured but cutting. This was Kenyatta. Alongside him sat other organizers, including men whose entire lives revolved around labor rights. Fred was introduced not with a title, but with a story. The room listened. "You stopped the trains?" Someone asked, eyebrows raised. "We stopped ourselves," Fred corrected. "The trains just noticed." Laughter cut through the tension, but beneath it something serious settled into place. The nationalist struggle had just acquired a new line of attack. Organized workers who had learned that they could seize the empire by the throat simply by refusing to move. In the months that followed, Fred plunged deeper into the world of unions. He helped organize rail and transport workers into a more formal body. He joined efforts to link different unions together, creating something larger than individual grievances, a movement. He found himself working alongside figures like Makan Singh and other committed trade unionists who spoke not just of better pay, but of a completely different future. In one crucial congress of workers, held in a crowded hall where the heat of bodies rivaled the midday sun outside, a decision was made to form a broader trade union organization that would speak for thousands. When nominations opened for leadership positions, voices began to call his name, first hesitantly, then with growing confidence. "Fred, let Fred stand." He had not campaigned. There were no posters with his face. Yet as he looked around that room, at carpenters and dock workers, clerks and porters, he understood something. Power is not always seized with fanfare. Sometimes it is handed to you by people whose hands are tired of carrying everything else. He accepted. That night, as newly elected officers shook hands and scribbled signatures on documents, far away in a government office, another file was updated. It bore his name in neat ink. Kubai, Fred. Underneath, new words were added. Emerging union leader, potential agitator, closely associated with nationalist elements. The rivalry with David did not fade with Fred's rise, it evolved. David, having accepted the role of liaison, now found doors opening to him that would stay closed to most Africans. He attended meetings where colonial officials spoke of responsible African voices and gradual advancement. In newspapers controlled by white-owned presses, his statements were quoted as evidence that moderate elements opposed extremist agitation in the unions. On paper, he seemed to be climbing faster than Fred, praised in official circles, trusted in administrative whispers. But when he walked through the yards and streets, he felt something shift. Men greeted him politely, but their eyes slid away. They listened when he spoke, but their faces remained blank. Respect born of fear and proximity to power is colder than the warmth Fred now encountered. The nods from strangers, the quiet thank you from a worker whose hours had improved after a union campaign. The way conversations hushed when he entered a room. Not out of fear, but expectation. The colonial government, watching this, decided that the window for controlling people like Fred was narrowing. They began to talk of new regulations, not just for workers, but for political gatherings. Files were thickening. Reports spoke of secret oaths being taken in forests, of discontent in the reserves, of chiefs losing their grip. Kenya was sliding toward a confrontation that could not be managed with gentle memos and advisory boards. For Fred, the sense of a ticking clock returned, fiercer than before. He knew, everyone knew, that open repression was coming. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but soon. The question was whether the workers and the political leaders could build enough unity, enough organization, before that hammer fell. Every meeting, every pamphlet, every journey to a distant town felt like stealing hours from an enemy determined to crush them. One day, he was summoned to a government office and offered a new bargain. Mr. Kubai, a senior official, said, his tone almost cordial, "You have influence, much more than a man in your position would have had 20 years ago. That shows progress, doesn't it? Now we would hate to see that influence wasted, or worse, turned toward destructive ends." On the table between them lay a typed document. "We are considering creating a labor advisory board," the official continued, "to consult on workers' issues. There would be African representatives, only a select few, of course, men who understand both sides. You could be one of them." An official voice. "You could help steer things in a sensible direction." Fred glanced at the paper. He knew what wasn't written there. The expectation that he would tone down strikes, discourage bold action, distance himself from nationalist firebrands. They were offering him a bridge. That ended on their side of the river. "Think carefully," the official added. "You are still young. You can have a long career, if you choose wisely. Time is running out for certain methods. The government will not tolerate disorder forever." Later, outside the building, Fred found David waiting. "You should take it," David said, eyes tired. "You can do more from inside than shouting from the streets. They offered me something similar. It's not betrayal, it's survival and influence." Fred looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not a villain, but a man walking a path that had once tempted him too. "You call it influence," Fred said quietly. "But who is influencing whom? They give you a chair, a nicer pen, a louder voice, but only as long as you say what they want to hear. The moment you speak for the people, they pull the chair away." "And from outside?" David shot back. "What do you get? Chants and prison walls. How long do you think you can outrun them?" The question hung in the air. It was more honest than anything the officials had said. "I don't know," Fred answered. "But I'd rather run toward freedom than sit still in a comfortable cage." He walked away without signing. Not long after, a massive rally was planned in Nairobi, a meeting that would bring together workers and nationalist leaders in a public show of unity. The authorities, wary of openly banning it, granted a permit with strict limits. The gathering could last until a fixed hour. After that, any assembly would be deemed illegal. Police units were assigned. Orders were given quietly. Observe, intimidate. If they overstep, move in hard. On the day of the rally, the city felt like it was holding its breath. People streamed toward the meeting ground. Men in work clothes, women in faded dresses, youths with restless eyes. Some came for politics, others for curiosity, but all could sense that this was not just another speech in a dusty field. This was a test. On a makeshift platform, leaders took turns addressing the crowd. Kenyatta spoke of land and nationhood. Others spoke of schools, of taxes, of chiefs who served foreign masters instead of their own people. When Fred stepped forward to the edge of the platform, the sun was already low, bleeding orange across the sky. He could see at the edges of the crowd the rigid lines of police officers, their rifles slung, their batons ready. A plainclothes official lifted his watch, checked the time, and looked up with a thin smile. Fred began anyway. He spoke not in polished phrases, but in the rough, direct language that workers used among themselves. "You know me," he said. "You know I am not a chief, not a big man. I learned my letters in small schools. I earned my living with my hands and my ears, listening to other people's orders. When I first sat at a telegraph machine, I thought the only power I had was to copy what they told me. But I have learned something. Power does not begin in offices. It begins wherever ordinary people decide that enough is enough." He pointed toward the workers clustered near the front. "They told us we had to accept their rules. We said no. They told us we had to accept hunger wages. We said no. Now they tell us we must accept a future where Kenya is always theirs, where we are guests in our own home. What shall we say to that?" The answer rose from thousands of throats, not in words, but in a roar. At the edge of the field, the officer checked his watch again. The permitted time was almost up. He signaled to the police commander. Men began to move, slowly tightening the ring around the crowd. "Your time is over," a junior official shouted toward the platform. "You must disperse, now." Fred heard him. So did everyone else. He could step back, thank the crowd, urge them to go home. It would be the safe choice, the reasonable choice. The clock, once again, was against him. Instead, he raised his hand for silence, just for a moment. "They say our time is over," he said softly, his voice rolling out over the suddenly quiet crowd. "Maybe on their watches it is. But our time, our real time, is only beginning." He started to sing. It wasn't a hymn from church or a song from the colonial songbooks. It was an old tune, reshaped with new words about unity, about land, about labor and freedom. One voice became 10. 10 became 100. 100 became thousands. The sound swelled, filling the space, crashing against the nervous line of police like a wave against a brittle seawall. The officer hesitated. To order an attack now, in full daylight, on a peaceful crowd that included women and children, singing rather than rioting, this would not be an easy story to explain to the reporters hovering at the edges, notebooks in hand. The government was not yet ready for open war. Not yet. "Stand down," came the order at last, muttered through clenched teeth. As the sun slid below the horizon, people began to drift away, still humming, still talking. No one had been arrested. Not that day. But something irreversible had happened all the same. From the back of the dispersing crowd, David watched Fred step down from the platform, surrounded by workers slapping his back. Leaders, clasping his hand, ordinary men and women looking at him with a kind of fierce gratitude. For a brief, unsettling moment, David felt not anger, but a pang of something like loss. The path he had chosen could never bring him this. That night, in police stations and government offices, reports were written. Phrases like seditious songs, mass defiance, and dangerous agitators appeared again and again. One name recurred so often that it seemed to imprint itself on the paper. Fred Kubai. From now on, his steps would be shadowed. His words would be recorded. The time he had to build, to organize, to turn that fragile, singing unity into something that could survive the storm ahead, was shrinking fast. In a modest room at the end of a long day, Fred finally lay down, exhaustion weighting his limbs. From outside came the distant rumble of a city settling into uneasy sleep. He did not know the exact date when the empire would decide it had had enough of him. He did not know how many days of freedom remained on his unseen clock. He only knew that, for the first time, he was no longer merely watching the trains of power pass him by. He was on board now, and somewhere, far away, hands he had never shaken were already reaching for the brakes. The first time they called Fred a terrorist, he was holding nothing more dangerous than a pen. On a desk in a grim office, under the pale glare of an electric bulb, lay a single sheet of paper with his name on it. Not a union petition, not a list of demands, a secret circular stamped in red. Principal agitator, possible Mau Mau sympathizer, subject to immediate detention if situation deteriorates. The man reading it aloud did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words did the shouting for him. Outside, Nairobi still buzzed with the aftertaste of the great rally, the songs echoing in alleys and bars. But inside government buildings, another sound was rising, the low, efficient murmur of a machine preparing for war. Fred did not hear the paper being stamped or see the pencil ticking his name on a list that would later be called the Kapenguria Six. He was in another smoky room, this one crowded not with officials but with fellow organizers, his fingers smudged with ink as he wrote notes for the next union meeting. He was doing the most dangerous thing a colonial subject could do. He was planning ahead. For the government, time was suddenly a fire they had to put out. Reports of strikes and rallies piled up. Rumors of secret oaths in the forests grew louder. One senior officer spread a map of Kenya on a table and stabbed it with his finger. "We are losing control of the towns," he snapped. "If the workers and the politicians and these forest fighters ever synchronize their efforts, we're finished. We can't let people like Kubai build that bridge." Orders came down fast, their language clipped and ice-cold. Prepare emergency regulations, tighten passes, restrict meetings, monitor suspect leaders. Files were passed from hand to hand, names underlined, photographs paper-clipped. Somewhere near the top of the stack, beside Kenyatta, Jomo, and Kagia Bildad, the ink around Kubai Fred grew heavier. The clock that had been ticking in Fred's life for years suddenly sped up. He felt it in the way meetings had to be moved at the last moment, hopping from hall to hall like quarry-dodging hunters. He felt it in the way new faces appeared at the edge of crowds, eyes just a little too watchful, questions just a little too careful. He felt it in the letters from outlying towns. Our organizer arrested, our permit denied, our leader beaten in the street. Each letter was a countdown, but he did not slow down. If anything, he moved faster. He threw himself into union work with a desperation that didn't look like desperation, only like urgency. He helped consolidate transport workers, railmen, dockers and clerks under broader umbrellas. He wrote speeches that bled into pamphlets that turned into whispered conversations in canteens. "We can't just fight each injustice one by one," he told fellow organizers. "They have rifles, prisons, laws. We have numbers, discipline and time. But time is the one thing they are trying to take away from us. So we use what's left like it's precious water." The rivalry with David was no longer confined to the yard or the meeting room. It had become a battle over what responsible African leadership looked like. In newspapers that served the government's line, David's measured statements were quoted approvingly. "Mr. D has denounced extremist calls for strikes," one editorial declared. "He represents the kind of reasonable African voice with which the administration can work." In house after house, men reading those words didn't need to see the full name to know who it meant. "David," they muttered, some with pity, some with anger. He had not started out intending to be anyone's example, but he had accepted the seats on boards, the invitations to receptions, the careful praise. One day he found himself in a room where officials discussed names for detention. "What about this man, this Kubai?" one of them asked, mispronouncing it slightly. "He's reckless," another official replied. "Dangerous. We'll have to pick him up when the time comes." David felt a chill as he realized they were talking about someone he had once eaten from the same pot with, someone whose jokes he still remembered. He cleared his throat. "He's influential," David said slowly. "If you arrest him, you'll turn him into a martyr." The room went quiet for a heartbeat, then dissolved into dry laughter. "We're past worrying about martyrs," an officer said. "We're worrying about losing the country." And that was that. A mark was made on a list. A man's future shrank to the space between two lines on a page. Weeks later, the emergency was declared. Kenya woke up to a world that had shifted under its feet. Curfews slammed down like iron shutters. Barbed wire appeared where there had been only dirt paths. Flyers announced new rules. No assemblies, no oaths, no movement after dark without permission. Police trucks became a common sight, rolling through neighborhoods like mobile warnings. For Fred, time narrowed from months and years into days and hours. He knew the crackdown was coming, but knowing and living it were different things. He watched as union offices were raided, papers swept into sacks, typewriters carried out like prisoners. He heard of leaders taken from their beds at night, of men disappearing into detention camps, whose locations were whispered but never confirmed. "You should lie low," a comrade urged him. "Go up country for a while. They're hitting the big names first. You are on their list." "Exactly," Fred replied. "If I vanish now, what message does that send? That their fear is bigger than our courage." Still, even he adjusted his routine. He changed routes. He varied meeting places. Once, he slipped out the back of a hall just as police burst through the front, their boots a drumbeat of authority on the wooden floor. Out in the alley, his breath came hard, not from running, but from the shocking closeness of it. How long can you keep this up? He asked himself, leaning against a wall slick with evening rain. The answer came sooner than he expected. One night, he returned to his modest lodging to find the air unnaturally still, as if sound itself were holding its breath. The neighbor's child, usually noisy, sat silently at the doorway, eyes wide. Inside Fred's room, on his small table, lay a folded scrap of paper. No name, no signature, just a hurried line. "They are coming. Before dawn. Go." The message could have been from anyone, a sympathizer in the police, a fellow organizer with a source, even David, trying in one last private gesture to tilt the balance. Fred would never know. He only knew that he held, in that moment, exactly what he had been fighting to win for Kenya. Time. Not days, not weeks, hours. He stuffed a few papers into a bag, then stopped. What was he doing? Running? Where? To the forests, to join men already called terrorists in official reports and freedom fighters in whispered prayers. To another town, to keep organizing from the shadows. To nowhere at all, disappearing like so many others into the fog of rumor. He sat down, the scrap of paper crushed in his fist. For years he had told workers that power came from standing together, not scattering. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. If he vanished now, he might save his body. But what would he do to the story they had been telling about themselves? The hours dropped away, one by one, like coins into a well. Just before the sky began to pale, truck engines rumbled in the distance. When the knock finally came, it was almost gentle. "Kubai," a voice called. "Open the door." He did. Flashlights exploded into the room. Hands searched his belongings with rough efficiency. A pair of handcuffs, cold and impersonal, clicked around his wrists. An officer read from a typewritten sheet, the words dragging like a heavy net. Seditious activities, subversive associations, suspected involvement in Mau Mau organization, threat to public order. On the street, neighbors peered from behind curtains as he was led to the truck. Some lifted their hands in small, invisible gestures of solidarity. One woman, braver than the rest, whispered, "We won't forget." He was taken not to a courtroom at first, but to a place of questions. Interrogation rooms are built to erase time. No windows, no clocks, no sky, only harsh light and repeated words. They changed the men who questioned him, softened their tone, hardened it again, switched from threats to fake sympathy and back. "Sign this statement and you'll get off easier," one insisted, sliding a paper toward him. It was a confession, full of crimes he had not committed and plots he had never heard of. "I will not help you build your lies," Fred replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "You are throwing your life away for nothing," another said, leaning close. "Do you think these workers will remember you in 10 years? In 20? They will forget your name and worry about the price of maize." "Maybe," Fred said, "but their children will know who built the price of maize." Days blurred. Then, without warning, the tempo changed again. He was moved, with 5 others, to face something that was meant to look like justice. The Kapenguria trial was staged in a remote town far from Nairobi's noise, as if the government were trying to conduct surgery in secret. The 6 men, Jomo Kenyatta, Bildad Kagia, Paul Ngei, Achieng Oneko, Kungu Karumba, and Fred Kubai, were presented to the world not as leaders but as criminals. Photographers snapped images of them through fences, their faces framed by bars and wire. In the official narrative, this was the moment the government exposed the brains of Mau Mau. In the whispered narrative that passed from mouth to mouth across Kenya, this was the moment the empire publicly admitted how afraid it was. Fred stood in the dock and felt something strange, a stillness that no gavel could shake. He listened as witnesses spun stories about secret meetings he had never attended, about oaths he had never taken. He recognized the structure, the careful stacking of accusations, but not the content. It was like hearing his own life described in a language he knew, but with every verb twisted. "Did you attend a meeting at such and such place?" the prosecutor demanded. "I have attended many meetings," Fred replied calmly. "Workers' meetings, union meetings. If that is a crime, then write it clearly." The judge, robed and composed, seemed less like a neutral figure and more like the final gear in a machine already set in motion. The verdict had been written long before the trial began. Still, every answer Fred gave was a chance to carve his own words into the record. Outside, people passed news of the trial like contraband. "They are charging them with leading Mau Mau," one would say. Does that mean union work is Mau Mau now? Another would ask. If so, then we are all Mau Mau, came the reply. When the sentences were finally read, years of hard labor, exile in remote prisons, the courtroom air felt heavy, not with surprise, but with the weight of something formal being placed on top of what everyone already knew. Fred walked out between guards, chains at his ankles, and heard a sound that made his throat tighten. A handful of spectators humming, under their breath, an echo of the song he had started at the rally months before. It was faint, almost invisible to the officers, but it was there. Prison tried to turn days into blank stones, identical and forgettable. The facility where the Kapenguria Six were held was remote, hot by day and cold by night. The air smelled of dust and disinfectant. Work details filled the hours, breaking rocks, moving loads, the kind of tasks designed not to build anything, but to wear men down. Yet even there, time refused to become empty. In the yard, during rare moments when guards' attention drifted, the prisoners talked, not in fiery speeches, but in low, concentrated exchanges. If we ever get out, Fred murmured to another detainee, we will need unions ready to defend workers in an independent Kenya, not just against white employers, but our own government if it forgets them. You're already thinking about after? The man asked, incredulous. We don't even know if there will be an after. That's exactly why I'm thinking about it, Fred replied. If freedom surprises us and we arrive empty-handed, what then? We will have gained a flag and lost everything else. Some guards listened, ears tuned to any phrase that sounded like plotting, but even they sometimes felt the slow shift. One young warder, Kenyan like the men he guarded, watched them with a complicated expression. To him, they were not monsters, not the savage caricatures painted in official posters, but men who moved with purpose even in chains. One day, as he passed Fred a ration of food, their eyes met. They say you are the ones making trouble, the warder muttered softly, in a moment of reckless honesty. But I think you are the ones making history. The years in detention were a test of a different kind of courage. There were no crowds to cheer, no headlines to record victories, no visible results. Only the stubborn decision, made every morning, to remain mentally present, to keep thinking, planning, refusing to let the walls define the world. Outside, the very pressure meant to crush the movement was reshaping it. Emergency villages were built. People were herded behind fences in the name of protection. Forest fighters continued their struggle. International critics began to question the British narrative. In Nairobi and London alike, the word Kenya acquired a new, uncomfortable association. Not just tea and tourism, but detention and revolt. The government had tried to freeze time by locking men like Fred away. Time refused to freeze. By the late 1950s, the cost of holding Kenya down, financial, political, moral, was becoming too high. The old certainty that the empire would last forever began to crack. Talks of constitutional reform surfaced, cautiously at first, then with growing seriousness. The logic shifted from, how do we crush them, to how do we manage the transition so we lose as little as possible. Inside the prison, rumors seeped through like water. Whispers of negotiations, of future elections, of possible releases. One evening, a guard approached the cell with an odd briskness. Kubai, he said, pack your things. Fred looked at the small collection of objects that represented his entire material life. A battered enamel cup, a worn blanket, a few letters he had managed to keep. It didn't take long. Where are we going? He asked. You're being released, the guard replied, his voice flat to hide whatever he might feel. Conditions, supervision, but you're leaving this place. The word released sounded almost unreal, like a story you tell children. Yet as Fred stepped out through gates he had once thought he might never see open again, the air hit his face with a taste he recognized. Responsibility. Freedom, he realized, was not a prize at the end of a race. It was a starting line. The world outside the prison had changed, but so had he. The young telegraph clerk who had argued with Foreman was gone. In his place stood a man whose name had become a symbol, whose face had been printed, smuggled, discussed. In Nakuru and Nairobi, old comrades embraced him with a fierce joy that bordered on disbelief. You are thinner, one said, gripping his shoulders. So is the empire, Fred replied, and they laughed, the sound edged with relief and anger and hope. The rivalry with David resurfaced in a new landscape. David had survived the emergency years differently. He had kept his positions on boards, advised in committees, drafted carefully worded memos about African advancement that nobody read twice. The government had needed men like him, especially when it became clear that independence was no longer an if, but a when. They wanted Africans who could be presented as reasonable partners, not radicals. When Fred and David met again, it was not in a yard or interrogation room, but in a corridor outside a conference where the future of Kenya's labor laws was being discussed. For a moment, both men simply stared. Prison had carved sharper lines into Fred's face, but his eyes burned with familiar intensity. David looked older in a different way, tired from years of compromise, from carrying the weight of being safe in a time that rewarded fury. "They let you out," David said, as if the fact itself were a kind of dare. "They had to," Fred answered. "They need people they can't admit they need." "You're still the same," David sighed. "Still talking like there's no cost to defying them." "And you?" Fred asked. "Have you found the cost of not defying them?" It was not shouted. There was no one around to cheer or judge. It was simply one question hung between two lives that had diverged from the same starting point. Inside the conference room, the conversation was about what kind of Kenya would emerge. Who would own the land? Who would control the factories and railways? Who would write the rules that governed labor? Independence was no longer a distant dream. It was a looming deadline. If the new constitution was written without workers' voices, their chance to shape the country could vanish for a generation. "Time is short," one sympathetic lawyer told Fred. "They're pushing through articles at a speed you wouldn't believe. If unions don't get their demands in now, you'll be fighting uphill for decades." The old urgency returned, now with a different target. Fred threw himself into the work, as if the entire idea of independence depended on whether a paragraph about workers' rights made it into a document. In a way, it did. A flag could be raised in one day. A system that protected or exploited millions would last for lifetimes. He argued for laws that recognized unions, that limited working hours, that prevented employers, African or European, from using the same dirty tricks workers had fought against under colonial rule. He reminded fellow leaders that the men and women who had suffered during the emergency were not romantic symbols, but people who would still need food, wages, dignity. "You cannot ask them to sacrifice for freedom," he told a gathering of nationalist politicians, "and then ask them to sacrifice again, so your businesses can grow." Some bristled. Power, once tasted, rarely liked to be told no, even by those who had helped win it. "Careful, Fred," one future minister warned. "Today we are comrades. Tomorrow you may sound like an opposition." "If the government forgets the worker," Fred replied, "then the union will be the opposition. That's not a threat. It's a duty." When independence finally came, with speeches and flags and fireworks, the cameras focused on the big podiums, the anthems, the official handshakes. Somewhere in the crowd, workers watched, wondering if the men in suits would remember the songs sung in fields and prisons, the strikes and secret meetings. Fred did not stand on the highest platform that day, but he stood where he had always stood, among the people whose sweat turned ideas into reality. Soon he would step formally into politics, elected as a representative, then serving as an assistant minister for labor, carrying workers' concerns into cabinet rooms, where polished tables reflected faces that had once been separated by bars and batons. But that journey, from prisoner to policymaker, was not a straight line or a happily ever after. It was another race against time in a new Kenya where the clock was no longer held by colonial officers, but by its own leaders. And once again, as Fred walked into rooms where laws were drafted and deals were made, he felt that old familiar pressure in his chest, the knowledge that the window to protect the people who had carried him this far was narrowing with each passing day. On the morning Fred first walked into a government office as an assistant minister, a policeman in another part of Nairobi was swinging a baton under a brand new flag. The cloth above the police post was different now, horizontal stripes, a shield and spears where the Union Jack had flapped for decades. But on the street below, the scene could have been copied from an old colonial photograph. Workers scattered, one man on the ground, his hands raised, the crack of wood against bone. The only real change was the color of the hands holding the baton. That was the hook nobody had prepared Fred for. Freedom had arrived with drums and speeches, firecrackers and tears, but it had not handed him a simple script. It had handed him something else, more dangerous, more complicated: power. In the first weeks after independence, the air in Nairobi vibrated. New ministries were announced like miracles. Old colonial titles disappeared, replaced by African names. The press printed photographs of former prisoners, former clerks, former agitators in suits, their shoulders squared, their eyes slightly dazed, as if they were still getting used to the weight of the door handles they were now allowed to turn. When Fred saw his own face in those grainy pictures, a part of him recoiled. He remembered iron beds in Kapenguria, the sound of chains on concrete. Now he was being called Honourable Member for Nakuru, Assistant Minister for Labour, key voice in the new administration. Secretaries greeted him with polite smiles. Drivers opened car doors. Files were brought to him for signing, each stamped with the crest of a Kenya that technically did not exist when he was arrested. "You've earned this," some of his comrades told him. "This is what we fought for." He wanted to believe them. But every time he picked up a pen in his new office, he felt the ghost of another pen, years earlier, signing detention orders that had changed his life. He could still hear the low voice that had once read out, "Principal agitator, possible Mau Mau sympathizer, subject to immediate detention." Now his signature would help decide who got jobs, who got protection, who got nothing. Power, he realized, was just another word for responsibility written in a larger font. The workers who had cheered him in dusty yards did not care about the upholstery of his new chair. They cared about rent, about food, about whether independence would erase the insult of being paid less for the same work, or simply repaint the signboards above the factory gates. He refused to move his home to an elite neighborhood. He stayed close to the streets he knew, where people stopped him and asked questions that were sharper than any parliamentary speech. "Mheshimiwa," one woman said, using the new respectful title, "you were in prison for us. Now that you're in government, will you remember us?" "If I forget you," he replied, "then prison was wasted." But memory, he soon discovered, was not enough. The new Kenya moved fast, and it did not always move in the same direction as his conscience. In cabinet meetings, he sat at long tables under fluorescent lights, listening to debates that sounded, in structure if not in accent, eerily familiar. "We must attract investors," one minister insisted. "Factories do not build themselves. If we scare capital away with strikes and aggressive unions, what do we tell the people?" "We tell them the truth," Fred answered. "That independence without justice at work is a flag without a pole. You cannot hang anything on it." Some rolled their eyes, some nodded politely and changed the subject. One man across the table gave him a look that was harder to read. David, the old rival, the careful moderate, had also found his way into the new order. Decades earlier, he had been the foreman who tried to channel anger into petitions instead of walkouts. During the emergency, he had been the reasonable African in administrative reports, the one who attended lunches and wrote memos, in language that comforted colonial officers. In independent Kenya, men like him were suddenly in demand. He appeared at conferences as a representative of African business interests. He sat on boards that controlled industrial policy. He was often quoted talking about stability, order, responsible partnership between labor and capital. Where Fred's clothes bore the slight wear of long use, David's suits were new, his ties smooth, his watch glinting in the light. "You finally got what you wanted," Fred said to him once in a hallway after a tense meeting, a seat at the table. David smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "And you finally got what you wanted," he replied. A chance to see how complicated this all is. Complicated did not begin to describe what came next. Barely 2 years after independence, the first major confrontation between the new government and the workers who had helped bring it to power exploded into the open. It started at the docks in Mombasa. Port workers, who had once been among the most exploited under colonial rule, expected immediate change. They wanted fair wages, allowances for dangerous work, proper housing. Negotiations dragged. Promises were made, postponed, diluted. One sweltering afternoon, after yet another meeting ended with soon, a group of men put down their tools and refused to load another crate onto a ship flying a foreign flag. By nightfall, the strike had spread along the waterfront like a fuse. Ships sat idle, cranes froze in mid-air, stacks of cargo loomed untouched under the stars. "Give them time," some urged in Nairobi. "We don't have time," came the answer from others. "Every day the port sits still, costs us money, weakens our new state. We cannot look weak, not to investors, not to the world, not to our own people." At an emergency meeting, the Prime Minister's voice was tight. "Labour is your docket," he told Fred. "Solve this." "What are the terms?" Fred asked. "You have 48 hours, the Prime Minister replied. 48 hours to get them back to work. After that, we send in police. We cannot let the first big story about independent Kenya be that we are hostage to our own workers. 48 hours. Fred felt the deadline settle on his shoulders like a physical weight. The clock he had lived under for years, time until arrest, time until release, time until independence, had turned again. Now it was counting down to something even more bitter, the moment when his own government might beat its own people in the name of order. On the plane to Mombasa, the cabin hummed with nervous conversation. Advisors shuffled papers. A military officer dozed with his cap over his eyes. Fred sat still, staring out at the thin line where sky met sea, hearing an old prison warder's words echo in his head. You are the ones making history. What kind of history would it be if within 2 years of independence, Kenyan police were firing tear gas at Kenyan dockers while leaders sat in air-conditioned rooms drafting statements about regrettable unrest? At the port, the scene was tense but not yet violent. Men gathered in clusters, their faces drawn, their voices low but firm. Pickets lined the entrance. Banners, hastily painted on old sacks, hung from railings. We fought for freedom, not for poverty. Respect workers, respect Kenya. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and something else. Determination. Fred walked into the crowd without security, the way he always had. Hands reached out to touch his arms, his shoulders, as if to check he was real. Bwana Kubai, one worker said, using the old respectful address. We heard you were in government now. Some said you'd forgotten us. If I had forgotten you, I would not be here, he replied. Tell me exactly what you want. No slogans, numbers, hours, conditions. They did. He listened, scribbling notes, asking precise questions. Not more money, but how much? Not better housing, but what standard? Inside a warehouse, in the thick heat, representatives of the workers sat across from representatives of the Port Authority, government, mediators, and an impeccably dressed man who introduced himself as speaking for the business community. David. You again, one of the older dockers muttered under his breath when he recognized him. The one who always says, let's be patient while other people bleed. David pretended not to hear, or maybe he heard everything and filed it away behind his neutral expression. From the start, he and Fred clashed. You must send a clear signal, David insisted, snapping his briefcase open and closed as if to punctuate his words. Yes, some adjustments can be made, but if you give in fully now, you set an impossible precedent. Every sector will threaten to strike whenever they want more. The state will be paralyzed. The state, Fred shot back, exists so the people are not paralyzed. They have been patient through colonialism, through emergency, through all the delays of independence. How many more years do you expect them to wait before they are allowed to live decently? The talks went long into the night. Outside, lines of police stood in the dark, helmets under their arms, riot shields leaning against trucks. The commander checked his watch every hour. The order from Nairobi was clear. At the 48-hour mark, if the strike continued, the police would move in. Inside, sweat-darkened collars. Coffee cups piled up. Voices rose, fell, cracked. The workers argued among themselves, too. Some wanted to hold firm. Others, thinking of hungry children at home, whispered about compromise. At 3 a.m., a proposal lay on the table. It offered wage increases, housing improvements, a commitment to review safety conditions. But no word, one union representative pointed out, on guaranteed recognition. If you can refuse to talk to our union tomorrow, what stops us from being back here in 6 months? All unions will be recognized in due course, David said, the words polished, meaningless. In due course is a trap, Fred said. I will not sell them a promise with no date on it. You are not the only one at this table, David replied quietly. Do not mistake your history for a blank check. The clock ticked. One of the government negotiators leaned in close to Fred. We just got a call, he murmured. Nairobi says if the men are not back at work by dawn, the operation begins. They've already loaded trucks. They are not bluffing. Fred rubbed his eyes. He thought of the woman who had asked him if he would remember them. He thought of the men in the cells at Kapenguria, of the guards who had warned him that people would forget his name while they worried about maize. He also thought of the thin budget files on his desk in Nairobi, of how fragile the new state's finances were. If the port stayed closed for days, salaries might not be paid. Hospitals might not get supplies. The whole country might lurch. Time did not feel like a ribbon stretching into the future anymore. It felt like a rope fraying in his hands. Give me 1 hour, he told the room. No interruptions. He walked out to the dockside, where a few men still kept watch under the fading stars. The sea breathed in and out, indifferent to human deadlines. "If they come in with batons," one young worker said, "we will not run. We ran from white policemen enough times." "I am trying to stop that from happening," Fred said. "Then don't go back in there and forget that you're one of us," the young man said. "We know you're a big man now, but if you sign something that betrays us, it will not be the government we blame first. It will be you." The words hit harder than any baton. He went back into the warehouse and fought for one more clause: union recognition. Not tomorrow, not in due course, but formalized with a date and mechanism. It was the kind of dry, legal line that never made headlines, but he knew what it meant. Without that, everything else could be taken away quietly later. With it, they had an anchor. David resisted. "This is too far," he said. "You are binding the hands of the state." "The state," Fred replied, "should have its hands bound by justice." In the end, exhaustion did what no speech could. Faced with a total collapse of talks and the spectre of blood on the docks, the government side accepted the clause. In slightly softer language, but still there. The union representatives, equally drained, accepted the overall package. At dawn, as the first light touched the cranes, word spread. "We got something," the workers muttered to each other. "Not everything, but something real." They went back to work. The trucks full of police turned around before they reached the port. Some officers grumbled about a wasted night. One of them, Kenyan-born, let out a quiet breath of relief. On paper, it was a victory. Wages up, conditions improved, unions recognized, at least at Mombasa. But in the quiet aftermath, the cost emerged. Back in Nairobi, some of Fred's colleagues were furious. "You nearly embarrassed us," one senior minister hissed in a corridor. "If that strike had lasted one more day, we would have been the laughing stock of Africa. Investors would have called us a mob state." "We would have been something worse," Fred replied. "A state that beats its own workers for asking for what we promised them." David, summoned to a separate meeting, was more measured but no less cold. "You won that round," he told Fred over a drink at a reception weeks later. "The workers sing your name in their songs again. But do you ever consider that if you keep pushing like this, you will not have a ministry from which to help them? They will replace you with someone more flexible. If the price of keeping this office is betraying what I told them in prison yards and meeting halls," Fred said, "then I will pay it happily." The system tested how serious he was. Over the next few years, smaller disputes flared. Fred backed union leaders who challenged exploitative African employers as fiercely as they had challenged European ones. He spoke against corrupt tenders, against land deals that displaced the very squatters who had fought in the forests. He publicly criticized a bill that would have given the government sweeping powers to restrict strikes in the national interest. "Whose interest?" he asked in Parliament, his voice carrying through radios into tea shops and living rooms. "When we say national, do we mean the nation of men in this chamber, or the nation of women in markets and men in overalls?" Some colleagues stopped calling him comrade and started calling him troublemaker again. Always in private, never on the record. Election season arrived like a storm over dry land. Opponents whispered that he was too radical, that he put unions before development, that he was stuck in the past, still fighting colonialism instead of building the future. Money flowed into his rivals' campaigns. Promises were made in alleyways and church halls. Bags of maize and stacks of notes changed hands at night. On voting day, the turnout in Nakuru was high. Women in bright dresses, men in worn jackets, young workers with ink on their fingers stood in line under the sun. Some greeted him warmly as he walked by. Others looked away, nervous, already calculating what it would mean to be seen supporting a man some in government wanted gone. When the results were announced, the numbers on the board told a simple story. He had lost. The official explanation was democratic choice. Unofficially, everyone whispered about how aggressively development funds had been steered into the hands of those who promised to unseat him, about chiefs who hinted that the government would look more kindly on those who voted correctly. Fred watched his name slide down the board. It was not like the first time authority had taken his freedom. Back then, handcuffs and chains had been involved. This time, it was ballots and stamps that closed the door. But the effect was similar. The system had decided his voice was too costly. When he cleared out his office, he kept almost nothing. A couple of books. A framed photograph of workers at a rally. The rest he left for the next occupant. "Where will you go now?" a sympathetic clerk asked, genuinely worried. "Where I have always gone," he answered. "To the workers." He returned to the union halls, their paint peeling, their chairs mismatched. The government had expected him to fade into comfortable retirement, perhaps to accept a board position here, an advisory role there. He refused most invitations that smelled like consolation prizes. Instead, he mentored a new generation of union leaders who had grown up in a Kenya where the flag had always been theirs. But the frustrations felt strangely similar to the stories their parents told. "These are not the same times," one young organizer insisted in a workshop. "We are dealing with multinational corporations, with structural adjustment, with foreign banks. This is not the colonial office." "Every system tells you it is new," Fred replied. "Ask yourself one question. Who holds the power to hire and fire, to set wages, to decide whether you can speak? If the answer is not the workers themselves, then the struggle is not as new as it thinks." He was no longer the man in photographs, standing behind microphones in Parliament. He was the older figure in the back row at union meetings, listening, occasionally rising to speak, his voice slower but still sharp. Time, which had once been something he raced against, now made itself known in stiffer joints, in the way steps took a little longer, in the lines on his face. He began to measure life in funerals as much as in rallies. He buried comrades from the Kapenguria days, men whose names had once been shouted by crowds and were now recited in obituaries read by fewer people each year. He visited graves of anonymous workers killed in incidents that never made the front page. He attended memorials for massacres that some officials preferred to forget. At one such gathering, marking the anniversary of a brutal crackdown on a farm workers' protest, he saw a familiar figure moving slowly through the crowd, leaning on a cane. David. Time had not been kind to him either. His once smooth face was mottled, his hair thin, his shoulders bent under a weight that did not seem to be only age. Rumors had drifted through Nairobi that he had fallen out of favor, that his alliances had shifted once too often, that business partners had dropped him when political tides changed. Their eyes met over the heads of younger activists who did not recognize either of them. They stepped aside, under the shade of a jacaranda tree, where purple petals fell around them like quiet confetti. "So," David said, his voice raspier than before, "it seems the world has moved on without us." "The world is full of people who think it has moved on," Fred answered. "But look at the banners, read the demands. Different names, same fight." David laughed once, a sound with more regret than humor in it. "They call you a hero now sometimes," he said. "Old Union legend, Kapenguria veteran. They invite you to speak at universities. They have not forgotten you after all. They remember a story," Fred said. "That's not the same as remembering the work." "What about me?" David asked suddenly, the question coming out more naked than he seemed to intend. "How do they remember me?" Fred was silent for a long moment. "As a man who often stood against them," he said finally. "Even when you thought you were protecting the country." David swallowed. His eyes shone with something that might have been anger or grief or both. "Do you know something?" he said. "That night before they arrested you, the note you found in your room, they are coming before dawn. Go." Fred's heart stumbled. "It was you?" he asked. "I thought if you ran, maybe you'd be spared," David said, staring at the ground. "I told myself I was doing you a favor. Later, when they said your name in those rooms and talking too loudly against your arrest would have cost me everything, I remained quiet. I let them take you. I convinced myself that prison would make you a symbol, that in some twisted way, it was for the best." He looked up, his gaze pleading in a way Fred had never seen. "I have spent years wondering whether warning you counted for anything," he said, "or whether my silence erased it." Fred felt the years between them collapse into a single image. Two young men in a yard, one already calculating how to work within the system, the other refusing to accept its terms. A crumpled note on a table, a dawn knock, a lifetime of consequences. "You gave me a few hours," he said slowly. "I used them to decide to stay. That decision shaped everything that followed. Your warning did not erase your silence. Your silence did not erase your warning. History is messier than that." "Then how will it judge me?" David whispered. "History is not a judge," Fred replied. "It's a memory. Some parts clear, some parts blurred. If you want different memories, you still have time to make them." "Not much," David said, tapping his cane. "The doctors say my heart is a slow ticking bomb." There it was again, the deadline motif that had haunted their lives. 48 hours at the port, an unknown number of days left in a failing heart. The constant, merciless pressure of time. For the first time in decades, their rivalry thinned into something else. A shared understanding that both of them, in their own ways, had been running against clocks set by others, by empire, by markets, by political calculations. Weeks later, word reached Fred that David had died. The funeral was smaller than the receptions he had once headlined, larger than some might have expected. Businessmen in dark suits stood beside older workers who had come out of curiosity more than loyalty. The eulogies spoke of service, of difficult decisions, of misunderstood patriotism. Fred listened from the back, then turned away before the final prayer. He had no interest in arguing with the dead. His concern was with the living, and with those not yet born. In his final years, when walking grew difficult, he often sat on a simple wooden bench near a busy road, watching Nairobi stream past. Matatus roared by, painted with the faces of pop stars and footballers. Office workers hurried, eyes on their phones. Street vendors called out prices over the roar of engines. Sometimes, not often, but enough to matter, someone would stop. "Are you Kubai?" a young man would ask, hesitant. "Depends who's asking," Fred would say. "I read about you in school," the young man would reply. "You were one of the Kapenguria Six. You were in the first government. You fought for workers." "A book cannot show you how tired we were," Fred would say, "or how afraid, or how often we argued among ourselves. But if it tells you we tried, then it is not lying." "What should we do now?" another might ask. "Times are different. There is no colonial rule. We have our own leaders. But still, rents, wages, corruption. Decide which side you are on," he would answer. "Not once, every day. And don't wait for perfect heroes. They don't exist. We were not perfect. We made mistakes. What matters is whether you are willing to pay the price of even small acts of courage." When he finally died, in the mid-1990s, the news did not cause traffic to stop. There were no sirens, no state holidays. A few newspapers ran headlines. "Veteran trade unionist and Kapenguria Six member passes away." Tributes came from old comrades, from union federations, from politicians keen to be photographed near his coffin. At the burial, under a bright Kenyan sky, the speeches painted him as something he had never quite allowed himself to be. A symbol, neat and complete. But away from the microphones, in the shade of a tent where workers in oil-stained shirts stood, the talk was different. "Remember when he stopped that factory from firing us without pay?" One man said. "Remember how he came to the picket line even after they pushed him out of government?" Another added, "Remember how he always said, 'Time is the only thing we can't get back, so don't waste it waiting for permission to be treated like a human being.'" Years later, a young organizer in Nairobi, preparing for a strike in a sprawling industrial zone, would quote that line without knowing exactly where it came from. The words would pass from mouth to mouth, acquiring slight changes, losing the name of the man who first said them, gaining something else instead, the force of a shared belief. In that sense, Fred's real legacy did not lie in the titles he held or the buildings he entered. It lived in the stubborn refusal of Kenyan workers to accept that any flag, however proudly flown, gave their rulers the right to treat them as expendable. It lived in the quiet courage of a dock worker who decides at 4 a.m. to stand with his comrades instead of slipping away. It lived in the hand of a young woman who raises a placard outside a factory gate, aware that police might charge, but convinced that silence is worse. Some streets would one day bear his name. Plaques would be mounted. School children would write essays about Fred Kubai, trade unionist and hero of the struggle. Those things mattered. Nations need stories to tell themselves. But somewhere in the living heart of Kenya, beyond monuments and textbooks, an older truth moved like an underground river. That once, in a world where time was weaponized against him, from colonial summonses to prison sentences to 48-hour ultimatums, a man had chosen again and again to spend his limited hours not on safety or comfort, but on the dangerous, exhausting task of insisting that ordinary people mattered. That choice did not make him a saint. It made him something more useful, an example, not of perfection, but of persistence, an example that did not end with his last breath, because it never really belonged to him alone. It belonged to anyone who ever picked up a pen or a placard or a microphone, feeling the clock ticking, and decided that even if the world called them agitator, troublemaker, or terrorist, their time would be spent forcing history to move, however slightly, toward justice,